Hi everybody, Scott Weaver from Factory Direct Window Treatments. Today we're going to build a cornice. So I'm going to show you what we need to build a cornice and upholster the cornice. A few items you're going to need. Of course you're going to need some fabric. And this is an option. This is what's called welting cord. I like to use, it's like around a 3/8 inch. You can probably pick this up at a Joann Fabrics. And you can sew this right to your fabric. And it goes on like this, and you can use a actual foot. They actually do make a foot, looks like this here, and pretty much when you put this on your machine, it's a little pressure foot and it comes on and you sew it. Or you can use a zipper foot if you don't have one of these. So this here, I think this is I'm forgetting, I think it's 12/32 or around 3/8 welting cord. And again, Joann Fabrics probably would have it in stock. So here's your welting cord that I've already made up right here. Got my fabric on it. And I've got my fabric that I'm going to be upholstering with. I got my drapery lining. All the tools you're going to need. This is 1/2 inch cardboard, tacking board. That's also an option. You don't have to use it, but I like using it. You're going to need a pencil. You're either going to need a stapler puller or a small screwdriver for staples that you may have to take out, and a needle nose, pair of pliers, pair of scissors. You're going to either or use drywall screws and a Phillips head electric screw gun. Of course, the tape measure is nice. And this here is an actual staple gun. It shoots an 1 5/8 staple, which is what I'm going to be using today. But if you don't have an air staple gun, a screw gun with sheetrock screws will also work. And a stapler, either an electric one or a handheld or an air staple gun. 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch staples is what I use. I don't because I'm using Oriental strand board. I keep it so it doesn't protrude all the way through. So anything over 3/8 of an inch staple, it would probably just go right through the board. And of course, these are for my air staple gun, the 1 5/8 staples. You're also going to want to have on hand a glue gun. I'm going to talk about the pieces. Oh, and this is a 1 inch Dacron padding. You can also find that at like a Joann's or your favorite fabric store. It's poly bonded Dacron, it's called, and I use the 1 inch version of it. They make a 1/2 inch also. Now the pieces of your cornice, you are going to have, of course, you're going to have the face of the board, and I'm using 7/16 Oriental strand board, OSB board for short is what I'm using on mine. And then I have what's called the dust board, which is the piece that goes on the top of it. And then I have the side boards, which are called returns. And if you're not using an air staple gun, it is very difficult when I put this together to use standard screws going through these since the walls of these are so small. So you can replace the dust board and the 2 returns with just standard pine, because you've got 3/4 of an inch. So it makes it a little easier when you're putting this on, and you can screw right into the pine. So remember that you don't have to use the OSB board. You can use pine. So with that said, we're going to move everything to the side, and then we're going to start making our cornice. I like to start with putting the returns onto the dust board first. So what you're going to do first, put this upright, put your return, butt it right up against there. Same on the side. And then I put on the face. You can see this is relatively an easy project. There we have it. This part's done. Now with the cornice all built, I took a little piece of sandpaper and I lightly sanded around the edges to make sure it has a nice clean finish on here. So the next step is to put the poly bonded Dacron on. Now there's two methods you can use. You either can use a spray glue like the 3M Super 77 glue, or you can just staple it on. If you have an air stapler, it's a little easier to do it that way, but if you're using a standard stapler, the hand stapler, you're probably better off gluing it on. So with that said, you want your batting to go around your sides, and you'll also notice I overcut the size of my batting. I didn't just cut it exactly the size, because I like to trim it off, give it a clean finish. So now you're going to go ahead and staple it on or glue it, whichever way you like. Okay, so now I've got the padding on my cornice and it's oversized, and like I mentioned before, the reason why you want it oversized is you actually want to stretch this on a little bit. You don't want it loose, and that's one of the reasons why I overcut it. I make the Dacron a little bit larger than I want, so I can stretch it on and then trim it off after. You'll also notice that I have a seam right here. Because the Dacron wasn't wide enough, so I added another piece and I just put a couple of staples in there. It won't show by the time I upholster it. So at this point I'm going to trim off all the excess, and pretty much so, just going to take your scissors and put it right. This does take a little practice, but you're basically going to use the piece of wood here, the return, or the dust board as your cutting surface. So it's just using that and trimming it off so you get it nice and clean. I'm going to do that going across the top and the bottom. Do it this way so you can kind of see. And it really doesn't matter if you glue this on or staple it, you get the same outcome with the Dacron. Then I'm going to do the top. Basically, you're just using the box itself as a straight edge. You're just putting your bottom of your scissors to the edge of the wood here and using that as a guide. It's just the way I prefer doing it. You can find your own methods. Now we're ready to put the fabric on. What I like to do is find the center of my cornice on the top. So take my tape measure, put it across. In this case it's 62 inches across. So I'm going to put a center line at 31 inches. And then with my fabric that I'm using is what's called railroaded. That means I'm not going to have any seams. If you were to seam this, if you were using a print, and you were seaming this because it's over the width of your material, you would have a seam on the left and a seam on your right. But in this case, I don't have any seams. But I still want to center my fabric evenly on the cornice, because if I did have seams, you would want, if it's 12 inches on this side as fabric seam and 12 inches, you want it equal. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little notch right here. And that tells me that's the center of my fabric. And then I'm going to take my fabric and I'm going to put the face side of it down on the table. So I'm looking at the back side, or the wrong side of the fabric. Like this. Then I'm going to line up the center mark of my cornice that was here with the notch. And the other consideration you're going to have is to make sure that when you're looking at your fabric here, that you have about the same amount. So in other words, on the top of here, I've got 2.5 inches of extra material on this, and then you want to come across over here and make sure you have roughly the same amount here. And a lot of times you can even see the pattern. Like if you have a certain pattern, you can actually see it and you can eyeball it. Now, next thing I do is I start upholstering my sides first. And I want to squish that padding down, that Dacron padding. I want to push it. I'm actually pulling this fabric. I'm also taking my hand and I'm making sure that that padding is compressed. I'm going to put a staple, I'm going to run my hand down, keeping my fabric compressed, using both hands, get it where I want it. Now this fabric actually has these dots on here, so I can line up these little dots to make sure I'm staying straight across. You also want to work left to right. Whatever you do, you go to one side, you work on the left side, then you go over to the right side and do the same thing on the other side. So I'm back over here. I'm just going to gently give my fabric a little pull to get it taut. Then I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to use my hand, compress the batting. And I'm going to work it all the way down. You keep close attention if you've got a pattern, a stripe or whatever it is, keeping it even. Or even just following the grain of the fabric. But somehow you want a guideline as you're putting your fabric onto your cornice board. Okay. The next step is to upholster the top. And again, this has these little lines in here. You see these little dots. So with these dots, I want to follow a line of dots all the way across to keep everything even. So what I'm going to do is, again, I like to work left to right. So, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a couple staples here. Then I'm going to follow that same lot of dots coming across. And then I'm going to come over to my right hand side and I'm going to put a few staples. Now the reason why I just did that, worked this side and that side, is because if you were only to start stapling on this one end, this fabric can start moving over. And before you know it, the fabric can be crooked. So by putting a few staples down here on my left hand side, coming to my right side, stapling that down, then I know that my fabric's in place. And especially if you had seams in here, you want to make sure your seams are staying straight. So if I had a couple seams, you definitely want to put a few staples here and a few staples here so the seams don't travel on you. And now, all I'm going to do now is staple all the way down to the other end, and then I'll be right back.